First, what I'd say is, writ large, I think that we find as a general rule, humans together with machines beat either humans alone or machines alone.
Hello and welcome to another Coffee with Mr.IoT. My name is Robert Schmidt. I'm Deloitte's Chief IoT Technologist, and today my guest is Scott Buchholz. Scott, you are one of the main authors of Tech Trends 2021, and we making this like an annual repeating thing. Thanks for being on again. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Robert. Thanks for having me back.
It's awesome to have you on. I have it open, so if I don't look straight in the camera while I talk, it's because I'm looking at that awesome report that we have out there. So, Scott, we've been doing this now for 12 years. This was the 12th edition. I've been looking through it. I don't even know where to get started, except I want to say I love page 2, where you sort of have the history of it. Um, I have to say, I laughed a little bit when I saw that IoT was actually starting to roll up this year into the digital workplace, but let's get to that later. Give us a little bit of an intro. Give us your executive summary of what you want to highlight, and then let's dive into some of them a little bit. I'd love to hear, I have some questions, and I also want to hear you talk about some of them. I know they're all your children, so you don't have a favorite, but
That's right.
the floor is yours, Scott.
Okay. So, Robert, as you said, we've been doing our research now for 12 years. We look globally across industries to try to figure out what's actually just over the horizon in terms of enterprise technology. So we're trying to predict 18 to 24 months into the future what's going to be at scale, things that are nascent today. We do a lot of different we have a lot of different ways we try to get that information and try to figure out what those trends are going to be. One of them is actually we interview clients and then publish their stories. We do that both so that we can make sure we're saying the right things, but also so that our readers can get a sense of what their journey might be like if they decide that this is something that's important to them. All of that's published on the internet. If you just drop Deloitte Tech Trends into your favorite search box, it'll take you right to the report. As I tell people, this year is a svelte 166 pages. It probably sounds more daunting than it is. It's actually quite consumable. And let's see, your other question, the types of trends. So this year, I think we actually talk about our trends in big buckets. So we have our heart of the enterprise trends around strategy and core systems and supply chain. We have the idea of data and all things that it enables in machine learning ops and the data revolution and zero trust. And then we have the future of interaction. And there we talk about basically the future of the digital workplace, the future of interaction with customers and clients, and then diversity, equity, and inclusion technologies.
So I have to tell you, I don't compare to last year, but I sort of started diving into this, and I got pretty quickly into page 12. Pictures always good for me, and I love how you like broke it down into enablers, disruptors, and horizon next. Talk a little bit about to me about this, how you broke this down. You know, you have quantum, for example, on there. It feels like something way out there. And we don't even have on-prem on anymore. It's sort of like the enablers cloud now. Just give us a little bit of your thoughts on this, and then there's the foundation underneath it, which is also important.
Sure. So for those who don't have the privilege of looking at Robert's screen, what he's talking about is what we call our macro forces view. And the macro forces actually evolved over time because what was happening was, if you looked at some of our first reports, they were a collection of things that were interesting at the time, but there wasn't a whole lot of structure to what was going on and how things were evolving. After a couple of years, what we started to notice was there were recurring patterns. And the recurring patterns were actually things that over time we started to realize we could use to observe and to start to predict a little bit more of what was going on. And so what's happened is it's emerged that this is the taxonomy that we use increasingly across Deloitte to try to describe basically what we're doing, what's next, how we think about investments, how we organize. And part of what happened was when we started, so this report was started more than a decade ago, what we were seeing at the time was things like cloud and analytics and what we call digital experience. It was everything around apps and social media and other things that were exciting at the time. And those things made huge change over the course of the past decade. And so then what we start talking about is the emerging trends, which are things like digital reality, right? So that's basically the changing ways that we're seeing where we're moving beyond screens and keyboards and mice for interaction with technology. On one hand, it's things like artificial intelligence and figuring out what to do with all the data we're collecting. It's distributed systems and all the things that are going on there. And then we actually have what we call Horizon Next, which is the over the rainbow stuff. So things that we expect to start seeing, we have notions of today, glimpses of that we expect to see start making big change in several years. Things like quantum computing, which I'm always happy to talk about because that's another one of the many hats I wear, but that's a different story. And then we have things at the bottom we call foundational, like the business of technology, which is all about how do you run IT efficiently and effectively, core systems, and trust, which is what we're realizing that this notion of cybersecurity and risk management and other things is really evolving towards. So that's probably the quickest orientation I can give you to that picture.
Well, we might actually try to put it on the screen while we edit this because I think it's a really great way to break it down. And I love how you call the Horizon Next over the rainbow. That resonates with me. I also have to say it's interesting to me, right? Because you have ambient experience in here, and it's almost like the renaissance of what we called in a few reports back ambient computing before we called it IoT. So
Yeah.
it's quite interesting how some of the stuff comes back. So, Scott, I want to ask you something about, and this is sort of the first one. It's called strategy engineered, and there's a lot of personal, what should I call it? Well, what I mean by that is, I always describe myself as a passionate technologist who likes to puts technology to good use, and that I think so many times what we find is we have strategy, we have technology, and how do you bring the two together? And so I find it super interesting how in a Tech Trends we talk about this from a strategy point of view. Talk a little bit about this. I guess maybe I want to close my question with asking you, when are we going to have the first CIO become CEO? And so I guess that's sort of like the underlying one behind it, and that might be a little too pointed, but just give me your thoughts on this because I love the thought around how technology becomes much more important for our strategy overall.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start with the last one. If I knew how to predict the future, if I knew when the next CIO was becoming CEO in a Fortune 500 organization, I'd be playing the right lotteries and we wouldn't be having this conversation. So
Fair enough.
the short answer is it seems to be something that's much more likely today than it was a couple of years ago. And so it's actually a really interesting question of when that might happen. But the trend that we're seeing sort of writ large is, I describe it this way, which is, Robert, I think as you were alluding to, traditionally corporate strategy has been perhaps the land of cufflinks and hardcover books. It's been the place where you do something every 6 or 12 months and you think really hard about things and you make a lot of important decisions. But completely divorced from, for example, the technology choices that were being made inside the organization, what people are realizing is as technology becomes increasingly the enabler in organizations, the coupling that we need between corporate organizational choices and technology choices is increasingly strong. Because if our strategy says, if something happens, we're going left, and our technology only lets us turn right, guess which way we're going? right? And so some of what we see happening is people saying, okay, that probably needs to change. That means that our well, one, we're in an environment where strategy clearly has to happen faster. Salesforce, when we talk to them, explain they cut their scenario planning from 5 years time horizons to 7 month time horizons for the pandemic. So clearly, we're turning things a lot faster, but also at the same time, what we're realizing is the folks who are defining the strategy and making the assumptions and choices have to have a lot more technology savvy and understanding than ever before, because they have to be able to have the meaningful conversations with IT about what this means for IT and vice versa. And it also means that technologists need a better understanding of business in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting one, and this is the one that I find myself often in. How do I speak more business, right? It's not about technology, it's about how to apply technology to a business problem. So I guess the biggest compliment I ever got in a performance review was, you're one of the few technologists that also speaks business. So it's a really interesting one, how we need to speak business and tech at the same time. And I love seeing this. I have a question for you around the same topic, maybe around strategy, but sort of like, what you're also the CTO of our government and public sector business. If you'd have to contrast commercial versus government and public sector, lots of things have changed in the last year, I find, in this area, it seems to me at least, and I'd be curious for your point of view on that, and what differences do you see?
Well, I think the last year has actually, so what's really interesting if you look back over the past year is, in a lot of cases, our CIOs and the IT organizations have been the hero of the hour. They were able to turn the corner in weeks and get people online working together in ways that none of us really anticipated. I mean, notionally, we had an idea that someday we might do more telework, but I don't think anybody anticipated 100% telework for almost a year or more. And so I think what we're seeing happen both in the commercial space as well as the government space is that now CIOs and IT leaders have actually more ability to go and say, hey, these are the things we need to be doing. There are, lots of interesting caveats to all of that. I think the thing to recognize is in many commercial organizations, there is a bit more of a reward for risk taking than there is in most government organizations. And so as a result, some of the risk tolerance that we see is a bit more structural than it is anything else. By the same token, I think people would be surprised and perhaps astonished at the degree of innovation that we sometimes see occurring in government, because it is as interesting or more interesting sometimes than what we actually see a lot of our commercial clients doing.
So thanks for that thought on strategy, and thanks for making this comparison between government and commercial. Interesting you also talked about last year how things have changed a lot. This had to be not just an interesting time for how we changed work, but probably the way the report was starting out earlier in 2020 versus how it ended. There's differences. What changed over the end of the report? Tell us a little bit of what the pandemic, the impact it had on this report, and how you see differences.
What was fun was we actually, let me think, we started the research for the report after the pandemic had sent everybody home. And we were in the early days of the pandemic, and I got a lot of questions about whether or not we were writing the pandemic technology trends report. And I told everybody that we were not. For a number of reasons, the first of which was what I said was, if everybody is still only focused on the downside of technology, and 2 years from basically where we sit today, we were still talking about the impacts of the pandemic in sort of the tactical sense, then we were going to have bigger problems and nobody was going to care what we said 2 years prior anyway. And so I said, let's think bigger. Let's figure out, COVID's going to accelerate a bunch of stuff. And at the time, because it was late spring last year when we started looking at our research topics, it was clearly starting to accelerate some dimensions. And so that was, like we said, what is it that's going on that's going to be accelerated, that are important topics? What are things that we can see are going to be on people's agendas? Let's project forward and hope that we're looking at some semblance of economic recovery by the time the report goes live. So that would have been projected for December of last year in 2020. And if we imagine all of those things, what are the kinds of topics that are going to be important to people? I don't know that we got all of those assumptions right, but I would say that, the economy is in better shape than it looked like it was going to be in the spring of last year. There are a number of other things going on that are at least headed in the right direction. And what's certainly been true is that COVID has accelerated a lot of things that people may have thought about planning for at some point in time, but it focused the minds in a number of cases.
That's interesting. I don't know who quoted this, but I think it was Joseph Fuller who said that the biggest fail in strategy is our assumptions. So
Yeah.
curious. It reminded me of what you said here. So you look today now, a year later, at COVID and the report and what's in there and what's not. If you would change anything, what would it be today, a year later?
I don't actually know that there's a lot that I would change. Actually, we're pretty proud of the report we put out. We actually are finding that most of what we're saying is resonating. Some things resonate a little bit more in some areas than others. That's actually pretty normal. Not every trend is relevant to every organization, and what people are currently focused on is different everywhere we go. I do, though, think broadly speaking that we got a lot of the right topics, a lot of the right areas. There are other things that are going on that are interesting, right? When you look across, and so there's always really interesting uses of technology. So image processing and image recognition. We have people who are using the fact that there are cameras in every warehouse to count inventory, to make sure people are practicing social distancing. You wind up with really interesting factoids. And so what then we do is try to figure out, okay, is that a trend? Is that a widespread trend? Where does that fit? And so we wind up, it's a really interesting sorting exercise that we get to do on an annual basis. We get lots of suggestions from folks like yourself, Robert, about, the future of sensors and lack of batteries and all sorts of fascinating stuff. And we kind of go, okay, what do we do? Where is all of this really going? So it's a great job. It's a fun job. We do pretty well. I'm pretty proud still of what we've gotten put out the door this year.
I have to tell you, I'm super proud of what you do. No matter if what I suggest goes in or not, I think I really don't want to be in your role where you have to pick. I mean, you already have 160 pages, so I think you do a great job, and I love how we and how you go about sort of like talking about the trend and then bringing actual real life examples to that. So, yeah, I love what you do. It's a great thing. I also find it also really super. What I wanted to highlight was the point you made, right? Not all trends are relevant to all people, but I find that if there's certain trends I can dive in, it helps you. You don't have to read all 166 pages of that.
That's right.
Let's pick some trend. I'll let you pick a trend. What's a trend you want to talk about? A trend you want to highlight? Something that's something we should talk about. Something that's particularly new this year, maybe.
Well, I'll tell you the one that I'm not sure I was expecting, but as a longtime data head was really exciting to me, was this idea of machine data revolution. And the story here is what people are discovering as they start doing more and more and more machine learning, right? As they start trying to figure out, Not how do we have a dozen models in production, but like some of the tech companies, how do we have thousands and tens of thousands of models doing things and useful activity, is we start to realize we've been storing and organizing data for 5 decades so that a small number of humans can make a small number of decisions with a small number of KPIs. Because humans can only deal with so much information and only make so many decisions. And yet machines have none of those limitations. If you think about, online recommendation engines, they use tens of thousands of data points to make millions of recommendations a day, mostly in real time, all the time. And so suddenly we're in a different world. And all the things that a lot of us grew up knowing to be true about what we need to do with data and how clean does it need to be and a whole bunch of other things actually go a little bit out the window. And we start having some really interesting problems about whether or not we're collecting the right data, whether or not we're storing and organizing it properly, how clean does something have to be. That's a really interesting debate. That one becomes a religious debate fairly quickly. Here's what I tell people is, in some cases, your machine learning models need to be pretty close to perfect. You're a regulated industry, you're making financial decisions about loans and other things. That's a really important use case. In a lot of cases, like online recommendation engines or other things, all you need is for your decision to be about as good as your best human. And your best humans are actually pretty tolerant of noisy data. And the algorithms can be as well. And so you need to decide where in the spectrum your decision falls. And then based on that, you can actually go through and figure out how much work do you need to do on the back end for some of the stuff. Anyway, there are a ton of like interesting places to go from here in terms of how you store data and manage it and everything else. But just the simple fact that we've been doing it for humans and now we have to do it for machines, it's been not just fascinating to go on the journey myself, but to watch some of our colleagues go on that journey too, where they started saying, this isn't a thing, right? And a couple months later would come back to me and say, there's really something here. And that's been, it's been really interesting.
I want to ask you a human question here, right? Because I'm so with you, right? We've been storing data in a certain way. We've only able to see it. We spend a lot of time of analyzing and deciding who gets to see what data, and then we make decisions based on that. And now we relegate, or we empower, or I don't know what word to use, machines to give us those answers. Do you find that people trust the data they get from the machine and make the decisions based on that? Because I'm asking this, I've seen some studies done that, particularly at the executive level, some companies still go back to relying on human data more than a huge amount of machine data, which I think in some ways is unfortunate because I think we need both.
Well, first, what I'd say is, writ large, I think that we find as a general rule, humans together with machines beat either humans alone or machines alone, right? And that's been true when we were talking about data-driven insights combined with human intuition. That's true whether you're talking about who is the best chess player. That's true whether you're talking about medical image recognition. Like, that's true across the board. And therefore, it is really true that what we have to think about is, I should probably not call it the social engineering exercise in public. So let me find a positive way to call it, because, if it were just you and I, Robert, I'd say we have a social engineering exercise, and the engineering exercise is how do we convince a bunch of humans to be more trusting of the data that they have in front of them. But what I would loosely say is, if you think about the notion of trust is something that tends to get built up slowly over time as people gain more and more and more evidence that the counterparty is trustworthy, and it is lost in an instant when the party demonstrates that they are not. And I think a lot of times, if you think about the history of the way we've done reporting, you'll say, the computer calculated the answer and it's 42. That is how much we sold, and somebody's intuition is like, well, I don't think it's 42 because da 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 da, and then suddenly nobody trusts the computer. And so some of this is a little bit more, if your computer were a human, then how would you do this differently? How would this evolve differently? By the way, computers are becoming much less calculators and much more human in terms of the way they're reasoning and probabilistic and everything else, yet we still hold them to the calculator standards. So although self-driving vehicles are arguably significantly safer drivers than my teenage children who are just learning to drive, we are happy to let my teenage children drive, and we are not so comfortable with the self-driving vehicles. Probably because we want the vehicles to be calculators and my children are permitted to be human. So I think there's this like fascinating psychological dimension to a lot of this, where we all have to help a lot of our peers go on a journey.
I sat once in it was a weekend thing, it was a workshop, and the person who was presenting up front said, trust is not something you earn, trust is something you give. And I sat there and my mind went, and it wasn't even my mind, it was like my whole body. I had like a visceral reaction of the thought of just giving trust rather than having people earn it. And once in a while I say this to people now in various conversations, and it typically results in a lot of quietness because it's such a mind shift around this. And whenever people talk about trust, I think about that statement. I don't know. So Scott, I want to ask you in closing a question that for me is sort of important in the sense of what do we do as Deloitte? So we do tech trends. How much of this do we eat our own dog food? I mean, I think of this particularly, some of the things are very relevant, right? The new digital workplace, right? The revival of the core. There's some things that all companies need to do, not just our clients. How do we do? If you have to give us a grade, if you dare to, what thoughts do you have on that in terms of how do we as Deloitte do with our tech trends, applying it to ourselves?
Our CIO published an entry in his blog a week or two ago, basically citing the trends and talking about the things we're doing as an organization. It was funny. I was pleasantly surprised to see it. I actually had no idea he was working on it. So it was just funny to see, Doug's take on tech trends. And I was like, well, well, this is kind of cool. How are we doing? I would say we're actually doing pretty well writ large. If you think about a lot of what we're trying to say in trends, we're saying, look, we're trying to figure out what is going to be at scale 2 years from now, which means that most organizations are on a journey to get there. I believe that collectively as an organization, we're doing better about starting to be willing to trust the artificial intelligence and the machine learning to help our humans. I actually think our auditors and our tax experts are actually doing a better job than our consultants in that regard. And so that's a really interesting discussion to look at, which is the people who are on the pointiest edge of the wedge sometimes are a little bit more the cobbler's children. And so that's an interesting discussion. I think, though, that, here's the other thing, too, is if you look at the digital workplace, one of the really interesting examples is before the COVID, we actually built a new boardroom, a global boardroom in New York City. And it turns out that what we did was we actually put cameras and microphones in front of every chair. And the goal of that was to make it so that people who weren't in the room had an equal experience to those who were, that sort of everybody was a little equal square on the screen. Not that the people who were remote were staring at a long table where everybody was able to actively participate. So in that regard, I think we're actually doing really well. I'm also a consultant, which means I can never leave well enough alone. And if I were asked for the opportunity to share all the things I thought we could do better, I think we would run out of time today. But I do have to give credit to our internal IT group, who's actually working really hard, who does a lot of really interesting things they don't bother to tell anybody about, and therefore don't get credit for. And some of those things I even discovered while we were doing the research, because we went to talk to some of our colleagues in IT and said, hey, here are some of the things we're thinking about. And they said, oh, we're thinking about those things too. Here's some of what we're doing. My favorite example was they were, on the diversity and inclusion aspect, they were actually looking at the way people's faces are rendered in Zoom. And there was a question of whether or not some of the backgrounds and other things could be made to have better experiences for some of our colleagues of color or people who might not have certain skin tones or things that show up well. If you had asked me whether or not that was a problem that anybody in our IT organization was thinking about, I probably wouldn't have said yes. And so I actually think, Robert, that some of what we need is for our internal organizations to take more credit for the really great work they're doing.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing this. I appreciate the insights, and thanks for your time.
Absolutely.
Any particular closing thoughts or comments?
Robert, I can talk about this stuff for hours, as I know you can as well. And so it's always fun to get to talk to you. It's always fun to get to trade stories with people. And, if people have suggestions or thoughts or feedback, I always welcome them, because what we're trying to do is figure out where the future's going. We like to think we're pretty good about it, but there's always room for improvement. And so I always welcome feedback from you and from everybody else.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I can only highly recommend you take a look at the topics that interest you. Each topic has the names of the people that worked on it, and all of them, including, I'm sure, Scott and myself, are happy to have a conversation with you. And with that, I want to say thanks for watching. This brings another coffee chat to a close. And if you missed any of today's or previous shows, check out our playlist on YouTube or your favorite podcasting channel. And thanks, and have a great day. Bye.